A billionaire walks into the White House. Hours later, the President of the United States threatens to block a nearly completed bridge, and officials are now scrambling to figure out if a multi-billion-dollar international crossing can be held hostage by a private citizen's business interests. We need to start with what happened Monday morning because the timeline here is everything. Multiple sources have now confirmed to news organizations that Manuel Marone, the patriarch of the family that owns the Ambassador Bridge, the only privately owned crossing between Detroit and Windsor, met privately with U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick at the White House. The meeting took place Monday morning. No readout was provided. No press was notified. No public statement was issued. What we do know is this. Hours later, the president posted a social media threat aimed directly at the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a 1.5-mile span across the Detroit River that is nearly complete, fully funded by Canada, jointly owned with the state of Michigan, and set to open in early 2026. The president wrote, quote, "I will not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them." He claimed Canada owns both the American and Canadian sides of the bridge. He said the bridge was built with virtually no U.S. content. He demanded the United States receive ownership of at least half the asset. He said negotiations would begin immediately. Every single one of those factual claims is false, not debatable, not a matter of perspective, verifiably, provably, documentably wrong. And here's why that matters. Because when a sitting president bases a major international threat on false information, you have two possibilities. Either the president was badly misinformed, or the threat was never really about the information at all. Let's establish what the Gordie Howe Bridge actually is. This project dates back to 2012. That's when Michigan's Republican governor at the time, Rick Snyder, negotiated a deal directly with Canada. The terms were specific. Canada would front the entire construction cost. Michigan would co-own the bridge. No Michigan taxpayer money, no U.S. federal money. Canada pays. Both governments share ownership, and both governments share toll revenue after Canada recovers its investment. It took over 2 decades of planning. It took nearly a decade of construction. It is one of the biggest infrastructure wins on the northern border in a generation, and it was set to open without controversy until Monday. Now here's what makes the president's Monday post so striking. In 2017, during his first term, the president himself called this same bridge a, quote, vital economic link between the United States and Canada. In a joint statement with the Canadian Prime Minister, he fast-tracked the project. He praised it. He endorsed it. That was then. Fast forward to February 2026. The bridge is on track to open, and the same president who called it vital is now threatening to block it entirely unless Canada pays compensation for something Canada paid for. Let's go through the president's specific claims one by one, because the gap between what was posted and what is true is not small. It is a chasm. Claim 1. Canada owns both the Canadian and American sides of the bridge. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, the Bashal organization created specifically to govern this crossing, confirmed this week that the bridge is jointly owned by Canada and the state of Michigan. Not Canada alone, Canada and Michigan. That is not a matter of interpretation. It is written into the 2012 agreement. The state of Michigan is literally a legal partner in this asset. Claim 2. The bridge was built with virtually no U.S. content, also false. American steel was used on the Michigan side of the river. American workers were employed throughout the project. The mayor of Windsor called this claim, and we are quoting directly, just insane. Former Governor Rick Snyder confirmed American involvement. The Bridge Authority confirmed it. U.S. labor was used. U.S. materials were used. The claim is simply incorrect. Claim 3. The United States is owed compensation for what? The United States did not fund this bridge. Canada did. The cost is confirmed at over $4.7 billion. No American federal dollars were spent. No American taxpayer funded this. The United States was offered co-ownership through the state of Michigan under the 2012 deal, and Michigan accepted. That agreement is the compensation. Michigan gets a stake in a multi-billion-dollar asset without having spent a single federal dollar on it. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke directly with the president this week to walk through these facts. Carney told reporters afterward, and I'm quoting directly, "Canada paid for the construction. Ownership is shared with Michigan. American steel and American workers were involved. He described it as, quote, a great example of cooperation between our countries. So the factual record is clear, the bridge authority is clear, Michigan's governor's office is clear, Canadian officials are clear, even the Republican former governor who negotiated the deal is clear, and yet the threat remains on the president's social media feed. Now let's talk about the Ambassador Bridge, because you cannot understand what happened Monday without understanding what is at stake for the family that owns it. The Ambassador Bridge was built in 1929. For nearly a century, it has been the only privately owned international bridge crossing in North America at the Detroit-Windsor corridor. One family, the Moround family, has controlled that crossing for decades, and for decades they have collected tolls on over $300 million worth of cross-border trade that passes through that single choke point every single day. Let that sink in. One private family, one bridge, $300 million a day. The Gordie Howe Bridge changes everything. It is publicly owned. It will offer lower tolls because it does not need to generate profit for a private owner. It needs to recover Canada's construction costs and operate efficiently. When it opens, commercial trucks will have a choice. Passenger vehicles will have a choice. The monopoly breaks, and the Moround family has known this was coming for over a decade. Let's go to the record. In 2012, the same year Governor Snyder negotiated the Gordie Howe deal with Canada, the Moround family spent more than $33 million on a Michigan ballot initiative designed specifically to kill the project. $33 million. Voters rejected it by nearly 20 percentage points, 59 to 41. The family then pursued legal challenges all the way to Canada's Supreme Court. They lost. They lobbied state politicians. They lobbied federal politicians. They donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to political campaigns across both parties, but heavily to Republicans. And then this week, according to multiple confirmed reports, Manuel Maroon walked into a meeting at the White House with the Secretary of Commerce. Hours later, the President of the United States posted a threat that, if carried out, would protect that family's monopoly indefinitely. Now, the White House is not confirming that the two events are connected. The press secretary said Tuesday that the president was, quote, defending American interests and taking issue with Canada's land ownership on the U.S. side of the bridge. That is the administration's stated position. But here is the problem with that position. The factual claims underpinning it are false. Canada does not own the U.S. side. The land on the U.S. side is owned by the state of Michigan. That is not a grey area. That is not a negotiation point. It is a contractual fact. So either the president posted a major international threat based on information that was factually incorrect, which raises serious questions about how policy is being developed, or the threat was never primarily about those facts to begin with. Neither option is good. Let's talk about what happens if this threat actually materializes. The president has not specified any mechanism for how the bridge would be blocked. The press secretary doubled down Tuesday, but offered no specifics. The Bridge Authority says the project remains on track for opening in early 2026. Canada says it remains on track. Michigan's governor says the bridge is going to open. So what exactly is the lever here? Here is what officials in Michigan are now saying privately, blocking the Gordie Howe Bridge does not hurt Canada first. It hurts Michigan first. It hurts Ohio first. It hurts the entire Midwestern auto supply chain. First, the Windsor-Detroit trade corridor handles over $300 million in commerce every single day. Cars built in Michigan and Ontario move parts across that border multiple times before a vehicle is finished. That is not an abstraction. That is factory floors. That is truck drivers. That is parts suppliers. That is dealership inventory. If the Gordie Howe Bridge is blocked, that commerce does not disappear. It gets rerouted back to the only crossing that remains open, the Ambassador Bridge, the private bridge, the monopoly. Both of Michigan's Democratic senators came out forcefully against the threat this week. One called it, quote, economic sabotage against Michigan. The other said the president was, quote, punishing Michiganders for a trade war he started. But here is what made headlines in Michigan specifically. Former Governor Rick Snyder, the Republican who negotiated the original bridge deal in 2012, published an op-ed this week directly addressing the president's threat, and his assessment was devastating. Snyder wrote that blocking the bridge would, quote, primarily harm Americans and would create exactly one winner, not the United States, not Michigan, not workers, not manufacturers, one family, one private bridge, one monopoly restored. That is a former Republican governor of a swing state, writing in plain English that a sitting Republican president's policy would primarily benefit one political donor. And let's talk about those donations, because this is not speculative. Financial records confirm that the Morround family has donated more than $65,000 to the president's campaign and affiliated committees. That is on top of decades of political spending at the state and federal level, specifically aimed at blocking competition to their bridge. Now, $65,000 is not a massive sum in presidential politics, but it is not the dollar amount that matters. It is the access, it is the meeting, it is the sequence of events that moves from a private billionaire in the White House to a cabinet secretary to a presidential social media post in a single afternoon. That is not how trade policy is supposed to work. Now, the White House has attempted to broaden the rationale for the threat. Officials are now pointing to Canada's recent moves toward China, and this part is real. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Carney visited Beijing. Canada and China announced what they called a new strategic partnership. Canada moved to ease some tariff restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles. China indicated it would reduce barriers on Canadian canola, lobster, and peas. From Canada's perspective, this is basic economic strategy. If your largest trading partner starts an unpredictable trade war, imposes tariffs, threatens annexation, weaponizes economic tools, you start building alternative relationships. You diversify, you reduce exposure, you protect your own economy. From this administration's perspective, that move looks like a threat, and the president responded by warning of 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Canada proceeds with any deal that he says would allow China closer access to the United States through Canada. The president's Monday Post explicitly referenced this. He wrote that Canada wants to make a trade deal with China, and he framed the bridge threat in that context. But here's what nobody in the administration is explaining. The Gordie Howe Bridge has nothing to do with Canada's trade relationship with China. It is a physical piece of infrastructure connecting Michigan and Ontario. It does not facilitate Chinese imports. It facilitates auto parts. It is not a policy lever for China policy. It is a bridge. So the administration is now attempting to retroactively justify a threat about one thing by pointing to an entirely separate issue. That is not policy coherence. That is scrambling. Let's zoom out for a moment because this week's confrontation is not happening in a vacuum. The relationship between Washington and Ottawa is under enormous strain. The president has repeatedly raised the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. He has imposed tariffs. He has threatened to decertify Canadian aircraft. He has targeted Canadian dairy, Canadian lumber, Canadian alcohol. The rhetoric has been relentless, and Canada's posture is shifting. For decades, and I mean decades, Canada's economic relationship with the United States was built on a fundamental asymmetry. The US was Canada's overwhelmingly dominant trading partner. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports went south. That dependence was not just an economic fact. It was a political lever. When Washington applied pressure, Ottawa had limited options, because the alternative, disrupting trade with your biggest customer, was almost unthinkable. That calculus is shifting. Under Mark Carney, Canada is deliberately diversifying. The China engagement is part of that. New trade discussions with European partners are part of that. The explicit political messaging around Canadian economic sovereignty, the Bionadian language, the counter-tariff responses are part of that. The president appears to understand this, and his response has been escalation. But here is what the escalation is actually producing. Every threat, every false claim, every demand for compensation on a bridge Canada built, each one accelerates the diversification it claims to oppose. Canada does not need to be convinced to look for alternative partners when its primary partner is posting social media threats about blocking bridges and calling for annexation. The case makes itself. Ontario Premier Doug Ford put it plainly this week. His message to the federal government, and I am paraphrasing here, do not roll over. Do not give in to threats built on incorrect information. Canada did not take advantage of the United States, and accepting that framing as the baseline for negotiations would be a strategic and factual concession that Canada does not owe. Ford also said something important about credibility. He questioned openly whether the threat would actually materialize, not because of goodwill, because of political self-interest. Blocking the Gordie Howe Bridge does not just hurt Canada. It directly hits Michigan's auto supply chains. It raises costs for American businesses. It creates uncertainty in a corridor that handles tens of billions of dollars in annual trade. And it hands Canada a ready-made justification for accelerating precisely the China trade relationship. The president says he opposes. The people who would suffer first and most visibly from this decision are voters in Michigan, Ohio, and the broader Midwest, auto workers, truckers, manufacturing employees, people whose livelihoods depend on efficient cross-border logistics, not on who collects the tolls. Several Michigan officials this week made that explicit. The governor's office, state senators, former governors, this is not abstract. This is supply chains. This is factory floors. This is prices at the dealership. The Gordie Howe Bridge was supposed to be a solution to border congestion that costs American businesses money every single day. Blocking it makes that problem worse. Now, let's talk about what happens next. The USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal renegotiated during the first Trump term, is up for review. Both sides know that review is coming. The administration has now added a major piece of border infrastructure to the negotiating pile. Infrastructure that primarily serves American economic interests if it functions and primarily hurts American interests if it does not. Prime Minister Carney told reporters this week that the bridge dispute will be resolved. He said it calmly, factually, without escalation. He said it like a man who understands that the other side's position does not hold up under scrutiny, and who knows the timeline and leverage better than the headlines suggest. And here is what that leverage looks like. Canada has already spent $4.7 billion on this bridge. It is nearly complete. It is set to open in early 2026. The only thing standing in its way now is a presidential threat with no clear legal mechanism, no factual basis, and no identified path to implementation. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority confirmed this week that construction continues. The timeline holds. The opening date holds. Michigan's governor said, and I quote, "The bridge is going to open." So what exactly did Monday's threat accomplish? It generated headlines. It put Canada on notice that any project, any trade decision, any diplomatic choice can become a flashpoint at any moment, for any reason. It demonstrated that unpredictability is itself a form of leverage, but leverage has a shelf life, and it decays faster when the claims behind it collapse this quickly. The mayor of Windsor called the president's claim insane. A former Republican governor called the threat primarily beneficial to one private family. Both Michigan senators condemned it as harmful to their own state. Canada's Prime Minister calmly walked through the factual record on a phone call with the president and told reporters afterward that it will be resolved. That is not the posture of a country that feels cornered. So here is where we are tonight. A nearly complete international bridge fully funded by Canada, jointly owned with the state of Michigan, set to open in less than a year, is now at the center of a political firestorm, ignited by false claims and timed to a private meeting with a billionaire who stands to lose a monopoly if the bridge opens. The administration has not explained the discrepancy between the president's claims and the factual record. It has not identified a mechanism for blocking the bridge. It has not walked back the threat. It has doubled down. Canadian officials are projecting calm. Michigan officials are projecting defiance. The Bridge Authority is projecting normally, and the family that owns the Ambassador Bridge is not projecting anything at all. But the question that is now being asked in Ottawa, in Lansing, in Detroit, and increasingly in Washington is not whether this threat is real. It is whether the presidency is being used to solve a private business problem. Because when a policy decision can be traced from a private meeting to a cabinet secretary to a presidential social media post in the span of a single afternoon, and when the primary beneficiary of that decision is the man who was in that private meeting, the line between trade negotiation and something else entirely becomes very hard to see. The bridge is going to open. That much is clear from everyone actually responsible for building it and operating it. What is not clear is how many more threats, how much more uncertainty, and how many more false claims will be deployed between now and then. And what is not clear is whether this is the last time a private meeting with a donor produces a presidential threat dressed in the language of national grievance. A billionaire walked into the White House Monday morning. Hours later, the President of the United States posted a threat based on claims that are demonstrably false, and tonight, that threat remains active. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.